backgrounds in philosophy was my training, but I've been teaching in communication studies at USQ for some time, and I've just recently been shifted to social sciences, teaching a social justice major. And so what I'm going to be looking at today is analysing student assignments for the first assignment for a first-year social science course, and I'm analysing it in relation to the RSD, but particularly looking at the degree to which they met the requirements for getting started and what they did in relation to getting started. So I did a textual analysis, and I related it to the New Zealand framework, information literacy framework, which maps onto the RSD. So I'm particularly focusing on whether they define their needs, whether they analyse the key concepts and define them in relation to specific issues with those tasks for this assignment. And so what I want to draw attention today is that there's some epistemological and ontological issues with doing those tasks that receive insufficient attention in the RSD literature. So there's a common sense or folk theory of meaning that treats meaning as subjectivist, and that concepts can be put into boxes and something's either in a box or it's in a different box. And so this is the basis for the law of non-contradiction. You can't have something that's both a gun and not a gun, for instance. So we assume categories are mutually exclusive. Now, I'm just going to work through a couple of examples that are based on what I gave the students in a lecture to scaffold them in their learning task. So, for instance, letters of the alphabet fit this conception of meaning fairly well. Letters are either consonants or vowels. But if we get to something like birds and we give a definition, there are birds that don't fit the definition so well. But as a result of new scientific research, we now know that the birds have evolved out of dinosaurs, and the dinosaurs share an awful lot of the characteristics of birds. And so you've got fuzzy categories that depend on all sorts of things as to what fits into it or not. And in fact, even with letters of the alphabet, a letter like Y sometimes works as a consonant and sometimes works as a vowel. So you've got to understand context. And interestingly, at this conference, a lot of attention I've gone to papers that are looking at problems with getting started and issues with context. So I'm going to try and emphasise that in what I talk about today. So here's another example I gave in my class to try and show students that what concepts mean depends on the model or theoretical framework it's used in. So this is a diagram of the calendar we're familiar with, the Gregorian calendar, where it's based on the motion of the Earth around the sun. And so there's a year that's more or less the same size every year, and we have the same months every year. And to teach you how concepts are theoretically dependent, I'm showing you the Babylonian calendar, which is organised around the moon's revolution around the Earth. So every month is a lunar month, but that means year by year the lunar months get out of alignment with the solar rotation. And it's common, the sorts of places that have this calendar or a calendar like it are dependent on agriculture. So you actually need your months to align with the solar thing. So whereas we have a leap day, these calendars have a leap month. And so every 2 or 3 years an extra month is added in to bring it back. And it takes 19 years for the moon, sun and Earth to be back at the same point as when it started. So what month and year mean depends on which calendar you're talking about. It's not something objective. So I'm trying to get students sensitive to the fact that the concepts they use depend on where they belong. So if they're writing essays, they actually need concepts relative to their discipline, not to their common sense background understanding. I've used the word tradition, but you could also talk about it in terms of language and culture. So people who come from one language background and move to another, lots of concepts as they're translated, in fact, are more like going from the Gregorian calendar to the Babylonian calendar. So it creates lots of potential for misunderstanding and misuse. Librarians have different category systems to the discipline specialists, and so there can be a mismatch between what the academic wants and how the library or databases are sorted and what sort of advice librarians give students. Everyone needs to be aware and know how to shift from how they take the world to the world they're jumping into. And so there's a problem with getting started of not knowing anything about the conceptual system you have to write in. Now, the particular assignment students had was a social science one where they were given a definition of social science as the critique of common sense. That means it was an essential requirement of the assignment that they question their common sense assumptions. So that creates a particular problem for getting started. Then they had to show how a series of statements were not true and draw on Charles Wright Mill's sociological imagination as the theoretical structure for organising their assignment. I gave them a practice sample statement to work on this, that welfare recipients are freeloaders, and they had to show why that may not necessarily be true. And I added in replace freeloaders with bludgers or leaners, and this was right about the time that you had some members of the coalition government using this language in relation to this statement. And so I said they can't just look up definitions, because definitions tend to rely on common sense folk theories of meaning. So if they use dictionary definitions, they're going to be prejudging what it is they're writing about. What they need is to collect data from things like newspaper articles to learn about the context in which the language is being used. And so there were, each student had to do 2 essays. This is a sample of my analysis, which shows how for each student I marked which of the 5 essays they did, which of the 5 questions they did, and I analysed it in terms of whether they relied on their opinion of what something meant, whether they used a definition, whether to do the definition they used a dictionary, relied on an authority, or whether they showed the sort of contextual understanding I was looking for. So there were 103 essays altogether, because some people didn't even follow the instruction and do 2 questions. Okay, so in terms of problem definition, these categories are not mutually exclusive, obviously. So 33% of essays relied on definition. The ones who relied on opinion and dictionaries were relying on common sense understanding. Some students used definitions from academics, but they weren't paying attention to academic context, so they would use authorities that weren't from the right discipline and weren't asking the right sort of questions that they needed to get a suitable definition. They were using philosophers and lawyers instead of social scientists, and they didn't understand the context enough to know what sort of authorities they needed. So some questions got more reliance on definitions than others, so the nature of the statement they were analysing made a difference to how they approached it. And so 12% of the ones relying on definitions relied on opinion, 41% relied on authorities, and 47% relied on dictionaries. So these are the dependent relations between things, not the raw count. So 18% of essays relied on authorities, but mostly not from sociology. And 69% of those who relied on authority relied on dictionaries. Those who used opinion 10% gave their own definition. So they gave definitions. They realised they needed to give definitions, but they didn't provide any basis for it. Okay, 35% of those who relied on opinion did question 4. Indigenous people are closer to nature. So I'm just going to do a little analysis of how that question makes some assumptions that are embedded in a culture they were supposed to critique. So our society is built on an environment-society dualism that sees society as outside nature, and so we can measure distance from nature, and it's part of a myth of progress that treats some cultures as closer to animals than others. And in order to unpick that statement, they actually had to be critical of this cultural common sense background knowledge. So only 8% of students showed any sensitivity to unpicking background cultural knowledge, so it was done very poorly. And 50% of the people who did it did question 4. I thought it might be because the students who did this were better students. I haven't done the statistics on that. The numbers are pretty small, but in fact it went across the grade range. So that didn't seem to be the issue. So in terms of getting started, 58% relied on things like their previous opinion or dictionaries that are basically folk theoretic common sense understanding. And 33% relied on definitions, not always from the right source. So I thought that I was doing pretty badly when I was doing with these results, that I hadn't succeeded in getting students to do what I want. But as a result of listening to FIS's analysis of the degree to which students looked at getting started, which was 0, even though students aren't doing what I want in relation to getting started, there's actually a huge proportion of the class is addressing the question of what do I have to show to get started. So the scaffolding I've provided hasn't been enough for them to do what I wanted them to, but it's actually got them thinking about the issue. And then Tim and Esma's analysis of assignment instruction showed again that getting started got the least attention from academics. So by giving it attention, we can improve student performance, but we need more experimentation about how do we get students sensitive to the context, which is the 8% is what I was aiming for. Like, that's what I wanted all the students to do. So I thought I'd done pretty badly, but after hearing what's happening elsewhere, I don't feel so bad about it. And so the problem for students that alternative category systems are unknown unknowns. They don't know, so they don't bother looking for it. So our task is we need to make them aware they don't know and what sort of research they need to do to get started. So this is the paradox, that to get started you need to identify key concepts to find relevant information, but to do that you need to understand the concepts and be familiar with the concepts. So you've got a Catch-22 with what you need to get started. You need the result of getting started to do it. And that's it.